Representative.
Yes, I am. How are you doing, Rocky?
Doing good, Congressman. I'm going to turn the screen over to you, and then afterwards we'll talk a little more. Okay?
Okay, sounds good. First of all, let me thank Tracy and the Andrus Center for putting this on and re-inviting me 2 years later after our first summit on energy, salmon, and agriculture and community, and looking at where we have come since then. I've listened to all of the presenters and the panel that you've had, and it's a very good group of individuals. And let me say up front, although I disagree obviously with some of the things that have just been said and some of the others, I want to tell you, I think everybody's acting in good faith. They're putting out their opinion, and that's the kind of discussion that we need, and that's the reason that we put out our concept that we've put out, although I think some people have misrepresented it. Let me start this by starting where I left off 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I talked about two issues that were very important. I thought they needed to be addressed and why they needed to be addressed. First was the Bonneville Power Administration and the financial challenges that they were facing. Those challenges still exist today. The second issue was how are we going to stop the decline and eventual extinction of the threatened and endangered salmon runs, particularly those in the Snake River. And I tried to explain how these two issues are intimately intertwined. I concluded my remarks at that summit that we had before 2 years ago with this observation. You know, we listened to an awful lot of experts in a variety of fields there. We had people in the audience from a wide background of professions, whether it was energy individuals or agriculture or environmentalists, fish biologists, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought we had a really good presentation from a wide variety of people. And I concluded with what was my greatest fear, is that everyone would leave that summit and say, you know, that was an interesting discussion. They brought up a lot of issues that were important issues that we need to discuss, but that after that, everyone would go home and say, okay, how do we protect what currently exists? And that would be my greatest fear, that we wouldn't be looking down the road what we want the Pacific Northwest to look like 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. That's human nature. That's what we do, is try to protect what currently exists. So what have we been doing over the last 2 years since that summit? I said at the time that I was going to do all I could to try to recover Idaho salmon runs. And I was going to stay alive long enough to do that. I hope that's still the case. But what we've done, we went to work studying the issues and the possible solutions and the challenges that those possible solutions present. We've had over 500 meetings in the last 2 years with anyone who would listen, who wanted to be engaged. And we've learned a great deal from those conversations that we have had. And yes, we have had them with the tribes, with environmental groups, with the governors of the 3 states. We've had them with stakeholders, with agricultural communities, with water users, and with others. And we continue to have those conversations and continue to learn from those conversations and to continue to implement some of the recommendations that they have made. But what we decided that there were really 4 fundamental questions that we were trying to address when we came out with our concept. The first one is, how do you make the BPA sustainable and competitive into the future? That's the issue that I talked about 2 years ago. That still hasn't been addressed. Second one is, how do we end the salmon wars? That's the endless litigation that we face all the time, and the amount of money that we spend in lawsuits over salmon recovery. The third one was, obviously, how do we restore the salmon runs and keep them from going to extinction? And I will guarantee you, the one thing I am certain of, after all the studying that I've done of this, is that these fish will go extinct if we don't do anything. If we just let the process continue as it is, they will go extinct. The fourth question is if it's necessary to remove the lower Snake River dams in order to save salmon. And I will tell you that every fish biologist that we've talked to, some people have said on these panels that, you know, the science is divided. I can tell you that the overwhelming amount of science from the fish biologists, the experts in fisheries, will tell you that if you don't remove the lower Snake River dams, these fish will go extinct. I'll explain that a little bit later. But if you're going to remove the lower Snake River dams, how do you make the stakeholders whole? That's why this is such a broad concept and why it involves $33.5 billion in trying to make those stakeholders whole. But based on these objectives and studying the issues with, as I said, the conversations we've had with stakeholders, with tribes, with the states, with the experts in the various fields, we released a concept. And I repeat, it's a concept. It's not a piece of legislation. What's the difference? If it was a piece of legislation, it would indicate that I'm ready to go with it. I'm trying to move that piece of legislation. We removed a concept, and the reason we did it is because this is a discussion that has to be had in the Pacific Northwest. I saw, frankly, as I looked at this, a train coming down the track. We can get in front of it and try to solve it ourselves, or we can let it run over the top of us. I think we ought to get in front of it. I suspect all of you know what the various aspects of this concept are. We released it on February 6th, and it's been out there for a few months. Our goal was to try to spur the discussion in the Pacific Northwest. It's certainly done that, maybe more so than I had ever anticipated. But I want to address the bigger question of that we need to ask ourselves. And that is, why did I kick this hornet's nest? Believe me, it would have been much easier in so many ways to just ignore this challenge. But the more I studied this issue, the more it became clear to me, as I said, we're headed for a train wreck. And I think it's our job as elected officials to try to address these problems before they come. If we don't, why are we here? And that's why I took this on and will continue to work on this issue. One thing we're certain of is the status quo is unacceptable. So the fundamental question is this: do we in the Pacific Northwest want to accept this challenge and chart our own future? Or do we want someone else to chart our future for us? Probably someone in a black robe. I think it's better if we determine our own future, where we can take into consideration the impacts of removal of the 4 lower snake dams. And as I said, after studying this issue and the life cycles and the recovery efforts that have been made in the past, the science dictates either removal of these lower 4 Snake River dams or the extinction of the Snake River salmon. We ignore science at our own peril. We've tried to address the impacts of these concepts on our stakeholders, and we've tried to make them whole. But if a judge makes these decisions for us, do you think that if a judge ordered the removal of the dams, and there is some question of whether a judge can order that or not, if they can't order the removal of the dam, one thing they can do is make it so damned expensive to keep the dams that your only option is to remove them. I think everybody agrees that they could do that. But if a judge makes that decision for us, instead of us making that decision and taking into consideration the impacts of the removal of those dams, do you think a judge would say, okay, we're going to take the dams out. Oh, and by the way, before you do that, make sure that you've made an alternative transportation system so that you can get grain to Portland and do it as cheaply as they do now on barges? Or do you think a judge would say, oh, before you take those dams out, make sure that you've been able to replace that power with other clean, firm power? I don't think so. A judge is going to enforce the Endangered Species Act. And you got to remember, the Endangered Species Act pretty much trumps every other statute. I understand why that is, because once a species gone extinct, it's extinct. Nothing we can do can bring it back. It's gone. But you know, it's interesting to look back at the history of salmon as I listen to these conversations that we've been having today. If you look back at England and Ireland and the decline and demise of the salmon runs in those countries, and then you look at what happened on the East Coast in the Atlantic states and the decline, in England and Ireland, it was a couple hundred years ago. 100 years ago, it was in the Atlantic states where they lost their salmon runs. And now what's happening in the Pacific Northwest, I find it very interesting that the arguments are almost the same. Different factors maybe, but the arguments are still the same. And it's this: there are so many factors that affect salmon. And I think Dan just mentioned all the different factors, as did David when he was talking earlier on the panel. there are a lot of different factors that affect salmon. What that gives everybody is the opportunity to say, no, it's not the dams, it's the ocean conditions. That's the problem. No, it's not really the ocean conditions. Those are cyclical and they come up and down. It's the predators. No, it's not really the predators. It's climate change. Well, no, it's not really that. It's the hatcheries. So everybody can point to something else. That's what happened 200 years ago in England. That's what happened 100 years ago in the Atlantic coast. That's what's happening today in the Pacific Northwest. We can always point to something else as being the cause. And that's the challenge we face today. The reality is they're right. There are a lot of factors that affect salmon runs. I noticed that Chris Wood talked about SARS rates. I wasn't going to get into the science of it at all, but I will just a little bit. He talked about how you need a SARS rate of between 4 and 6 to have a healthy, sustainable run. That's how fish biologists measure the success or the health of a salmon run. The one thing nobody has been able to explain to me, all of these people that focus on ocean conditions and predators and other things, is when a salmon comes into the Columbia River, it can be a salmon that's headed for Salmon River Basin in Idaho. It can be one that's headed for the Yakima Valley. It can be the Yakima River, and it can be one that's headed for the John Day River. They go through the same ocean conditions. They go through the same predators. They go over the same dams as they're coming up the Columbia. And then those going into John Day, they take a south turn and go down the John Day drainage. Their SARS rate are healthy and sustainable. The ones that go up the Yakima take a turn to the north. Their rates are healthy and sustainable. The Snake River salmon go east. They go up the Snake River, where they have to go over 4 more dams. That's the lower Snake River dams. The SARS rate on those fish, by the time they get over the last of the 4 dams, is about 0.8%. That's headed toward extinction. The only difference between those and the salmon going up the John Day and the Yakima is that they have to go over 4 other dams. They go, as I said, they go through the same ocean conditions, the same predators, same everything else. And nobody's been able to explain to me how the dams aren't causing that. We've talked about how effective the dams are on fish passage, over 90%. I keep hearing some people would disagree with that. But the fact is it's not just the fish passage at the dam. It's almost a misnomer to say that we have a lower Snake River. We don't have a river anymore. What we have is a series of slack water pools that get lethally hot during the summer, lethally hot to salmon. And it takes about 10 times as long for a smolt to go through the passage of these dams as it did when it was a free-flowing river. That means they're more susceptible to predators. That means they're more susceptible to lethal temperatures in the water. It's not just the fish passage. It's what the dams do to the river itself. So as I said before, the status quo is unacceptable. What I have asked everyone that I've talked to, whether it was Dan Newhouse or Kathy McMorris Rogers or others in the delegation or any user group, if you've got alternatives that will work, let me know. Tell me about them. I'm interested in hearing them. So far, it's just been silence. Because I think everybody knows in their heart that if you're going to stave these salmon, you've got to take these lower Snake River dams out. That's what the overwhelming amount of science says. So that's what we're looking at. And as it's been mentioned, what I'm trying to do right now, this is a complicated issue. I'm trying to get the resources into the infrastructure bill so that it can be put aside in the Columbia Basin Initiative and held there, and can't be used until we come to a conclusion in the Pacific Northwest of what we're going to do. And that's going to take some time. It might take a year or two to actually write a bill. But we need to have these conversations in the Pacific Northwest, and we need to have honest conversations with people. The biggest challenge that we face, frankly, is that this involves change. Human beings are animals that generally don't like change. I like to know that the sun is going to pretty much come up tomorrow where it did today. But change is coming, whether we like it or not. A friend told me just before I gave the speech 2 years ago at the Andrus Center. I didn't use it at that speech, but I've used it a number of times since. He said, everything we do on the lower Snake and Columbia River, we can do differently. When Ice Harbor was built, they needed the power because of Hanford for national security. Even though Congress had refused to fund it for a number of years because, as the chairman of the committee at that time said, this was 1953, said, the building of this dam will mean the extinction of a species and we can't contemplate that. That was 1953. We've known this problem was coming for a long, long time. And yet we've tried everything else we can to save salmon. When I first heard that dam removal was something that we ought to be looking at, I was in the state legislature. I actually started to laugh when I heard that. I said, we ought to try everything else before we go to that final measure of trying to save salmon. Guess what? We've tried everything else. I don't know what else we can try in order to save the salmon. And as I said, the science certainly dictates that you've got to remove these dams. And as I said, a friend told me everything we do on the salmon and lower, or on the Snake and the Columbia River, we can do differently if we choose. That's choices we make. Salmon don't have a choice. They need a river. Right now, they do not have a river. We need to continue these discussions. This is not the end of the discussion. This is the beginning of the discussion. Let's honestly operate in good faith. I have not heard one person, in fact, 2 years ago, if I would have said to everyone in that room, how many of you want to save the BPA and make sure that they're competitive into the future, that we get the low power rates out of them, every hand would have gone up. If I'd have said, how many think agriculture is important, that we ought to make sure that they have security and certainty into the future, every hand would have went up. And if I would have said, how many of you think we ought to save Idaho salmon runs, every hand would have gone up. I have not heard anyone say they want Idaho salmon to go extinct. I just heard Mr. Newhouse say he wants to save salmon as much as anybody. Most of the time when people say that, what they mean is, I want to save salmon as long as I don't have to change anything that I'm doing. We can do things differently. I refuse to believe that a society that 52 years ago could put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth, or discover the mysteries of the atom, can't find a way to save these salmon runs, maintain our economy, make sure that we have the clean power that's necessary for the future. We can do this. It just takes the willingness to discuss it, debate it, and face the challenges that we're facing. So Rocky, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you might have. It's been an interesting discussion. It's good to get back to what we were talking about 2 years ago and see where we've come since then. Rocky?
Yeah, hi there.
You're back. You were
Thank
taking a
you
break.
very much. That was really good. So, Congressman, we heard a lot of criticism before of your proposal, and you answered some of them. One of the pieces of criticism that's come from at least one group of environmentalists is they're very worried about your litigation moratorium. Yeah. And they're worried that we're going to have all kinds of environmental problems that will pop up and go undealt with if that happens. How do you, you have this mix of wanting to provide that certainty but also to ensure that we're not just going to go out and rape and pillage the landscape.
Yeah.
How do you answer that?
Well, I think we need a moratorium on litigation for a while. I mean, we've spent $17 billion trying to recover salmon, and we haven't recovered salmon. We send 400 or close to 500,000 acre feet of water down the river every year trying to recover salmon. It hasn't recovered salmon, and we've been in court fighting these buy-offs and everything else for years and years, spending millions of dollars on that. I think we need a moratorium on the lawsuits and try to actually recover salmon. And I find it interesting that the environmental groups that are concerned with this, I don't know if I've interrupted their business model or what, but it is, and I call them the extreme environmental groups. I found it interesting that they ran an op-ed the other day that said, well, Simpson's just trying to save agriculture in Idaho. Well, they're partly right. Yeah, I am. I'm trying to provide the certainty and security that they need in order to engage in what's coming up. But the agricultural people in Idaho will say, well, Simpson's forgot his roots with agriculture and he's just trying to save salmon. It is, I don't think protecting agriculture, protecting the BPA and making sure that they're competitive into the future and saving salmon are mutually exclusive. We're smart enough to be able to do all three of those things. But again, it does involve change. But I understand their concern. If there is another way to put a moratorium on these lawsuits for a while we try to work on actually saving salmon, I'm more than willing to look at it.
Well, good. Several people have asked me, so have you had discussions with the Secretary of Interior or other cabinet members about this, and how are they going?
No, I haven't had discussions about this specifically with other cabinet members, maybe just in passing, but I haven't really sat down and had a discussion with them. There are others that are having those discussions with the secretaries and with the administration. I know that those are going on, as I said, trying to get these resources into a Columbia Basin initiative that was walled off from spending, so that whatever we decide, and I don't know what that will be, but after we've had a full discussion of this over the next year or so, that we would have the resources to do it. You have all seen programs where Congress comes in and passes an authorization for funding for some program, puts the program in place, then the funding never happens. I'd like to have the funding in place in order to be able to do this once we come to the decision of how we're going to address this problem and how we're going to face this challenge.
So I have another question from someone who wants to know, how can we help you with your proposal?
Well, it's a matter of being willing and talking to people and have them being willing to sit down and have a discussion of this. I have found that I've been able to have people, when I've been able to sit down with them in small groups or one-on-one, have them put the pitchforks down and say, yeah, this is an interesting idea. And I do see that you're trying to address the stakeholders and make sure that they're whole through all this. That's why it costs $33.5 billion. I will tell you a brief story. I was in practice with my dad, and he had a brother that my dad since passed on, but he and his brother were outdoorsmen. They loved to go hunting and horseback riding, all that kind of stuff. They love Idaho's wilderness and outdoors and stuff. And my uncle, who is like 93 now, and my mother and their other brother get together and have lunch once every Monday. And I went and sat down with them. This was last November. Had lunch with them, and we were talking about politics. They always like to know what's going on in Washington and everything. And I said to him, I said to Farrell, I said, all hell's going to break loose come 1st of January. He says, why is that? I said, well, I'm going to release this plan on salmon recovery and BPA and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, it's going to call for the removal of the 4 dams on the lower Snake River. He was an engineer at the Idaho National Laboratory. And he looked at me, he says, that's just stupid. And I said, really? I said, why is that? He says, well, we need the electricity. I said, when those were built, you either had hydropower or coal. They decided to build hydropower. I said, there are so many different ways we can produce electricity now that we can find alternatives. And anyway, I kind of let it die as he was kind of mulling it over, thinking, this is a crazy idea. And then he and my mom got discussing when he and his wife and mom and dad used to go horseback riding up in the wilderness. Farrell was saying, one day we came upon this stream and we were looking down at it from this ridge, and there were all these black rocks out there. And we thought, wow, that's kind of weird looking. And then we saw them started to move, and we realized they were salmon. And he says, we spent all day just watching all these salmon and stuff. And they were laughing and giggling about it, and what a great time they had. And when we were getting ready to leave, I looked at Farrell and said, those sound like some great memories that you have with mom and dad and your wife up in the wilderness and the salmon and stuff. He says, yeah, they really were. And I said, would you like your great-grandchildren to be able to create those same kind of memories? And he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, I would. He's all on board now. So
wow.
If you can get out and talk to people, but I can't get around and talk to 1.5 million people in Idaho or how many million in the Pacific Northwest. I'm doing everything I can. I'll be off 3 weeks next week away from Washington, and we'll be talking with groups and organizations and associations. I know that I'm proud to have Earl on board with me, and Earl and I don't agree on everything that we put out as our concept. I'm not saying this concept is perfect. It's a discussion point. And Earl and I can sit down and talk about these things, and we hope the public will be willing to sit down and talk with us also. But it's a matter of getting other people to actually sit down and listen. We knew when we released this plan that it would all focus on dam removal, even though the plan is much broader than that everybody would focus down on dam removal. But there's been about 25 collaborative efforts over the years of trying to save salmon, whether they put together by different organizations or groups or governors or whatever. I have no reason to believe that this latest BIOP won't be overturned. Then what's a judge going to do? When I look at the Idaho working group that Governor Little put together, I applaud their efforts, but they didn't talk about the elephant in the corner of the room, and that was the dams. They might have talked about them, but they didn't come to any type of resolution on that. I have no reason to believe that the 4 governors task force, unless they seriously consider dam removal, is going to come to a conclusion that's going to actually save salmon. So this needs to be a discussion we have in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, the other questions I have really are about some of the details. The spending. People are wondering if are you suggesting that you'd like Congress to get that spending out ahead and not go into all the details that you had laid out in this? How do you see all that happening?
One thing that has some people, I think, concerned about this proposal, some people who don't want to see dam removal, as our concept has dam removal in it. And we put the value of the dams in trying to make the stakeholders whole and trying to make sure that we can replace the energy production and stuff in about $33.5 billion. Some people are concerned that if they put that into a Columbia Basin initiative, that would mean they endorse our concept. I look at it as they endorse solving this problem. I don't know what the final plan will look like. If it doesn't cost $33.5 billion, you don't have to spend it all. If it costs more than that, then we got to go back to the drawing board. But it is important that we have that commitment to solving this problem. And I don't, as I think Linda Mapes said, I don't know if you don't get it in this infrastructure bill, I don't know where else you're going to get that. It would be much more difficult to get later on.
Well, I'm just going down here on the questions. People ask all kinds of suggestions. Well, in the panel, I talked about the idea of a grain pipeline. Some folks here are saying, why don't we just open up all the docks or all the locks on the 4 dams?
That was proposed, Rocky, some time ago. We've had some people actually look into it, and they say that probably just doesn't work, because it was kind of an interesting idea when I first heard it also. And I don't know exactly how the locks operate, why that wouldn't work. But what you've got to do is you've got to reestablish a natural river somehow, and whether it'll open up the locks would do that or not, or whether you would still have pools that you're dealing with behind those, because the locks don't go all the way to the bottom of the dam. I don't know. But I've had some people looking at it, and they say that's just not going to work.
So one of this proposal has raised a lot of ire in Idaho. Obviously, the legislature, came out pretty strongly against breaching dams. Heck, the governor took a pretty good shot at the whole idea of saying it would be devastating. Didn't seem to look at the mitigation in there. How are you doing politically with all of this? Is this hurting you?
Don't know. Haven't done any polling on it or anything. Don't plan on doing any polling until we've had a chance to kind of explain ourselves. But, as I said earlier, if you're not trying to solve a problem here, then why are you here? And I do see a train wreck coming. I want to avoid that, and I want us to determine our future. And if that were to cost me my election, so be it. I'm okay with that. As long as I think that we're doing what is necessary. I get a kick out of the resolution the legislature passed, and then I think the Idaho Republican Party passed one, and several county organizations passed one, and so forth and so on. And I've said to them, listen, I know what you're against. Tell me what you're for. Are you for saving salmon, or do you want to let them go extinct? So let me know. If you got other plans, let me know what they are. If you got other ideas, let me know what they are. Are you for us continuing to send nearly 500,000 acre-feet of water down the river every year while our aquifer goes down? And guess where that water goes? It makes those pools behind those dams stay full so that A, you can barge, and B, you can pump out of there to irrigate land in Washington. That just doesn't make sense to me. But if that's what you're for, just let me know that. So are you for keeping the Bonneville Power Administration rates as low as we can keep them by making them sustainable into the future? Are you for providing some security and certainty for our agricultural producers? I want to know what they're for. I know what they're against.
Yeah, I saw that Custer County was one of those counties that you've worked long and hard with on the Boulder White Clouds and other things, and that's where a whole lot of that spawning habitat is.
Awful lot. People talk about, they say, well, Idaho dams don't have any fish passage. And they always go to the Hells Canyon complex and Dwarshak, but they never mention Grand Coulee. I noticed that you mentioned Grand Coulee. Well, the state of Washington and the state of Oregon both have laws. And I think in Washington, it was their first legislative session, and in Oregon, it was their territorial legislature passed a law that it was illegal to block a run or river that had an Andrus fish in it without adequate fish passage. And then they just continue to ignore that statute. That's why Grand Coulee is there without any fish passage. And it blocks the most, next to the Salmon River, the most habitat for salmon in North Idaho and even into Montana and stuff. And so it is, we can all point fingers at what Idaho Fish and Game did with poisoning fish, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago and stuff like that. That doesn't get us very far in what we're dealing with today. But people like to point at that kind of stuff. And what I've tried to tell them is, what I'm trying to do is open up the most important fish habitat in the Pacific Northwest, and that's the Salmon River Basin and the Stanley Basin in Idaho. And if you put it out on a map and you see what that opens up, And, you know, it's been mentioned, and I should say this, and I can't say it enough times, the tribes have been fantastic to work with. They understand the importance of salmon. It's in their history, their culture, their religion. And every tribe that I'm aware of that had a treaty with the United States government maintained their fishing rights. Well, those fishing rights don't mean much if there's no fish. So we have an obligation to try to preserve these iconic species because of the treaty rights that we have with Native American tribes. And I will tell you, I have never been more proud to work with anybody than I have with the tribes in working through the issues on this.
So you also have money in your concept to help restore fish above places like Grand Coulee and Hell's Canyon, right?
Yeah.
What that hasn't got quite as much press up in Washington as maybe it got here, but that several of those tribes, that's a pretty big issue for them, isn't
with
it?
the show bands, they're the ones that wanted to see that, and so we, you know, salmon in Idaho could never go all the way to Fort Hall and the Snake River and everything because of Shoshone Falls that blocked them. That's the farthest they ever went. But they would like to see salmon reintroduced above the Hell's Canyon complex. So we put money in there for them. The other thing we've done in this that a lot of people don't recognize is we've taken management of fish and wildlife out of the hands of the BPA. I've always thought it was strange that the BPA was in charge of both power marketing and power production and marketing and fish recovery, because sometimes those two are in direct conflict. So we've taken management of fish and wildlife out of the BPA's hand, capped the amount that they would have to spend on that at $600 million a year, and put it into a fund that is managed by a representative of each of the 4 states and 4 of the tribes. So there's an equal number of votes there to give them an equal say in how these fish and wildlife are managed, and they would have the resources to do that. So we've changed that. We've also created some watershed partnership programs that would be throughout the Pacific Northwest to help improve the water quality in various areas. As you know, in the Middle Snake River in Twin Falls area, we've got issues with high nitrogen and phosphorus because of the confined feeding operations and other types of things. And those are a challenge that we're dealing with. They would have resources to deal with cleaning that water. Same thing is true in the Wallowa Valley and in Yakima and in the Puget Sound, actually, also.
Wow.
So that's why I say it's a lot broader concept than just taking 4 dams out.
Well, we have this. We've had an amazing discussion today, and you've talked about environmental justice, and that should be. It seems like that's another one of those elephants in the room that we've had to deal with, and we haven't dealt with.
Yeah,
it's almost like a reckoning, so to speak. Do you think that this bill? I noticed that the Yakima are supporting you, and aren't they in Representative Newhouse's district? I
think I've spoken with the 16 tribes. They've had their meetings together, and both Earl and I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, as well as Governor Brown talked to him, and those tribes are all behind it. I understand they're trying to get the tribes in the Puget Sound on board, and I think they're doing a pretty good job of getting them on board. And I think there are also other tribes from across the country that are interested in supporting the Nez Perce, and Chairman Wheeler has been incredible to work with. He's done such a fantastic job. You heard his emotion and his feeling on this and what it means to the Nez Perce people in his remarks earlier in the day.
So I just got one other question came in here, and just so why is it just the 4 Snake River dams that we're talking about? Why aren't we talking about John Day and the Dalles, all these other dams down below?
Well, you heard Mr. Newhouse say, yeah, once you start these 4 dams, then you're going to start taking out all the others. This is just the start of the slippery slope of taking out all the dams. These dams are the ones that stop the lower Snake River. That are on the lower Snake River stop Idaho salmon from coming back. As I mentioned, the SARS rate, and they make it over. Is there a loss of salmon over these other 4 dams? Yeah, there is. The ones on the lower Columbia River, but the dams on the lower Snake River are different than the dams on the Columbia River. The lower Snake River dams are run-of-the-river dams. They're not there for flood control or anything else. They produce power and they allow you to barge. That's pretty much what they're there for. The ones on the Columbia River are what keep feet dry in Portland during floods. They used to get terrible floods in Portland and that kind of stuff. They actually have a role in flood mitigation that the other 4 dams don't on the lower Snake River. So they're fundamentally different. But there's the reason that we put in the automatic relicensing of dams for a period of time, 35 years, is to stop that argument about, yeah, the environmentalists just want to take out these 4 dams and then they'll move on to the next ones and pretty soon they'll be all gone, These 4 dams have a different meaning. That's why we're taking them out.
So if we, can you see the region, you've opened up a lot of discussion that wasn't there certainly 2 years ago, yeah, and even more so since February. How do you see this discussion moving forward? Whatever happens in Congress, how do you see us getting, getting to the solution that we want? Is it going to be in the governor's hands? Is it going to be in your hands? Some other congressmen downstream?
The governors are important. It will take, as I said, I think, February, March, April, 3 months is all this has been out. So we've got to have a lot more discussion and a lot more thoughtful discussion with people in the Pacific Northwest. There were a lot of good points brought up today by the Tri-Cities Economic Development individual, by David, and by Sam, and the others that have some real opposition, I guess, to removal of dams and stuff. They brought up good points. We need to continue to have this discussion, but you would be surprised how many people, even legislators here in Congress, will come up to me and say, I like what you're doing there, but my people aren't there yet, so I can't publicly say that. A lot of that goes on. And in fact, even at meetings that my staff attend, some people will come up and say, tell Mike to keep doing what he's doing. But I can't say that publicly. People are nervous about that. As you know, politicians are very risk averse. And if we can avoid taking a political risk, most of us will do that. And so I think you're seeing a lot of the individuals that I thought would have been more excited about this to start with, kind of sitting back and saying, let's see how much Simpson gets his rear end handed to him on this before we jump on it. But that's okay,
Well, you're going to find a lot of folks in the Boise area. I saw a big ad today. Did you see that? They had a big ad in the Idaho Statesman today supporting you.
Nikki told me about it, but I hadn't seen it.
Yeah, so those kind of things, I guess, are one of the ways this stuff happens. But I hope to find a path. I hope you find that path. I've walked with you on some paths up to the base of Castle Peak, and you made that one all the way to the summit.
You made it in pretty good shape. I was shocked.
So I wish you good luck in your travels. And so we're about ready to wrap it up here. Do you have any final statements there?
Well, listen, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the Andrus Center for what they're doing and keeping this discussion going. Maybe in a couple of years we'll check in again and see where we are, and maybe we'll be a lot further down along the road and actually have some legislation going on. But we'll be in touch with you as we move this forward, and as we have discussions with other people. And I'm sure people will bring up issues that we haven't thought about, and that's okay. We need to hear from people about this. So, we sent out a flyer. It kind of surprised me. I don't know if you got one or not, but it was all to second district residents and stuff. And it kind of discussed it a little bit and had a return card. We've got about close to 2,000 of those cards returned. And it's surprising, I'd say more of them are in support of what we're doing than opposed to it. And about half of the ones that are opposed to it because they don't like ending the lawsuits. So that's, I found that kind of interesting.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Rocky.
So